Hello everybody and welcome to this brief video over what groups can do to your identity. Now, in a previous video, I've discussed how groups tend to provide a social identity, all right? Basically, that's that aspect of your self-categorization, your identity, that's related to your group membership. And we know from, well, let me go ahead and share my screen with you from my visual aid. Boom, there we go. So we already know that we can develop a social identity from our group. I talked about that in another video. All right, so part of the reason, but because we establish part of our social identity from our group, we tend to be motivated to have positive evaluations of those groups. Because if our group membership is wrapped into our self category, this group is part of how I categorize myself, then we want to have a positive evaluation of that group so that we can have a positive evaluation of us. All right. If we have a negative evaluation of a group that is part of our social identity, then it can impugn, it can negatively affect our self-evaluation. It can negatively affect our self-esteem. All right. But under certain circumstances, groups can have different effects on our identity. So certainly, right, they can give us a sense of identity. They can add to our sense of self-identity. But under certain circumstances, they can also remove a sense of identity. All right, they can lead us to de-individuate. All right, so when we de-individuate, we essentially begin acting in uncharacteristic ways. And this is largely due to the fact that our actions become de-identified. It becomes difficult for us or other people to identify that we are the causes of our behavior, that we're responsible for our actions. Now, there's a couple situations where this is more prone to happen. So for example, if anything makes you more self-aware, you're probably going to be less likely to de-individuate. All right, so if things make you more self-aware, then you're going to be less likely to de-individuate, where if things make you focused on outside things, that's going to make you more likely to de-individuate, so separate yourself from you. All right. So you might think of a concert, right? Or one of my friends likes to go to trance clubs, and so she may have this de-individuating experience because you have this music and the dancing and all the activity going on around them. And so all of these external cues can lead a person to stop focusing on, internal aspects. They may decline in self-awareness and begin to engage in more public awareness. And so this can lead them to de-individuate. And sometimes de-individuating can be a very pleasant experience. Certainly my friend who goes to trance dances loves it for, I imagine, at least partly that de-individuation, right? It kind of frees you to a certain extent. Certainly in the 1960s, when LSD was a popular drug, one of the more common effects of that drug was a sense of de-individuation. They didn't describe it that way, but they described it as a becoming more part of the whole rather than kind of losing yourself. The way they most often described it is becoming part of something bigger. But that is de-individuation. You're losing you, and they say it expanded their consciousness, right? So it makes them feel like part of something bigger. So certainly the experience of de-individuation can feel good and it can be experienced positively, but it can also lead to negative consequences. So for example, you may have heard of a phenomenon known as mob mentality. And so although they still occur today, as far as I know, lynchings happened far more in the past in America. And in these events, we have a lot of things that cause people to focus outwardly and less things that cause them to focus inwardly. And so we get chances of de-individuation. And so people act in potentially terrible ways. So with lynchings, a mob killing a person, all right? So mob mentality involves de-individuation, all right? So when a mob goes and does something and they act in ways that are, I'm sure, are totally uncharacteristic of them. So you might get a person hanging a person, such as in a lynching, or breaking into a store, such as or burning the store to the ground, or breaking into homes, or pulling people from their vehicles and beating them senseless, as was done in the race riots in the early 90s. These events provoke de-individuation, all right? They focus the individual on things outside of them, public awareness, and instead of focusing them on the inside, private awareness, right? So in these circumstances, de-individuation is more common, and people behave in a way that is very uncharacteristic. But what about if you don't actually have a group around you? What if you just are able to act in a semi-social environment and you can separate your actions from your identity such that you can act freely and nobody ever associates that behavior with you? Well, if that happens, that's also de-individuation. And we see this online a bit. It's a phenomenon that we sometimes call trolling, right? So people get on YouTube videos, people get on Facebook conversations, and they just become complete jerks, right? They're trolling, right? That is a kind, you can think of that as a kind of de-individuation. So groups can they can enrich our identity. They can also, for at least periods of time, separate our anxiety or our identity. They can also potentially reduce our sense of responsibility for our actions. All right, and so we call this the diffusion of responsibility. Now, a kind of classic example of this is the story of Kitty Giavisi. She was a waitress, I believe it was in the 50s or 60s, who was assaulted outside of her apartment complex. She, screamed and asked for help multiple times. Her fellow tenants in her apartment complex, at least once, maybe I think a couple times, stuck their heads out their windows and, yelled at the assailant, and he left. But none of them ever called the police or went to check on Kitty Giavisi. And so the assailant came back at least once, maybe a couple times that night, and ultimately killed her. Now, what happened here? You've got a lot of people, obviously they saw her, obviously they knew she needed help because they yelled at her assailant to leave her alone. But nobody went to see her. Nobody went to help her, right? Nobody called the police either. So what happened? Well, this is the diffusion of responsibility. As the number of people in a situation grow, the sense of responsibility that each individual in that group has decreases. All right, and so whereas we usually tend to think that that we're safer when we're around other people, around bigger groups rather than smaller groups, that the research suggests that may not be as straightforward as we would like it to be. As the number of people around us grow, the chances of diffusion of responsibility setting in grows. And so we get what's called the bystander effect, right? Which is just the diffusion of responsibility that occurs when witnessing an event with others. All right. All right, guys, that's it for this video about the effects that groups can have on our identity. So yes, they can enrich our identity, but they can also, at least for a short period of time, neutralize our identity and reduce our sense of responsibility. All right. All right, guys, as always, if you have any questions, send them my way. If not, I hope you have a great week, and I'll see you later on.